Welcome to Public Engagement with Science, Defining and Measuring Success. My name is Heather Douglas, and I'm in the Department of Philosophy at Michigan State University. I want to thank everyone for joining us on this afternoon, or depending where you are, it might be morning still. Here is the format for today's webinar. So each panelist will speak for 10 to 12 minutes. Panelists will then have 10 to 15 minutes to discuss the issues raised in their talks with each other. I'm sure they will have a lot to talk about. And then we'll open the floor to questions and answer questions from the audience. Please use the Q&A function in Zoom to ask questions. You can also, in that function, comment on questions and upvote questions for the panelists. Please do follow the community standards for the event, which are found on our website and was also linked to when you got your registration confirmation. On Twitter, please use hashtag PEWS2020 to talk about the event. Recordings of the talks will be posted on the YouTube channel, PEWS2020, after the event. If you have a hard time finding that channel, just searching YouTube, you can find a link to it from our website. And for any technical issues that we can help you with, many things we cannot, but some things we can, please email us at pews2020.tech@gmail.com. Okay, so that is the basic mechanics. The panel that we have today will focus on public engagement work that seeks to partner with particular communities, often communities that are struggling with environmental justice and health issues. Such work raises issues of power dynamics and trust that are more potent than with the volunteer collaborations we discussed yesterday. We have two sets of panelists today to help us think through these issues. The first being academics who partner with communities, and the second being community representatives who partner with academics, which is the panel that will follow this one at 3 o'clock. In this panel, we have an excellent group of people to tell us about their work in this area. First, we have Laura Schmidt-Olabisi, who is an associate professor in the Department of Community Sustainability and in the Environmental Science and Policy program at Michigan State University. She was recently a AAAS Leshner Leadership Institute Public Engagement Fellow and is a board member of the Academy for Systems Change, an NGO dedicated to training systems leaders for sustainability transformations. Then we have Nicholas Shapiro, who is an assistant professor in the Institute for Society and Genetics at UCLA, where he conducts multidisciplinary environmental research that studies and designs interventions for issues of chemical contamination and climate change. Then we have Yanna Lambrinidou, who is an affiliate faculty in the Department of Science, Technology, and Society at Virginia Tech and co-founder of the Campaign for Lead-Free Water. Focusing on the problem of lead in U.S. drinking water, she works at the intersection of environmental ethics, environmental health, and environmental justice. And finally, we have Gwen Ottinger, who is an associate professor at Drexel University. She serves on the editorial board of Citizen Science, Theory and Practice, and the board of directors for Public Lab. This year, she is an ACLS Burkhardt Fellow, when she is working on a new book, Mending Fence Lines, How Science Can Enhance Social Justice. So you can read more about each of our panelists, including statements about how they think about success in their work on our website. But now, let's hear from our panel. Turn it over to Laura.
Great, thank you, Heather. Let me just share my screen here. All right, looks like we're up and running. So thank you so much, Heather, for that introduction, and thank you all for coming out on a actually beautiful Saturday afternoon to spend some time online with us. It's a pleasure to be here. We've been talking about this conference for quite some time now, so it's exciting to have it finally here. So the topic of this panel is community university kind of engagement. And so I'm going to tie that to the overall theme of the conference in my talk by discussing what successful community university research partnerships might look like. So these are just some thoughts for consideration. Obviously, I am not the, the end all be all of this topic, but just some things that I've learned in the course of my work that hopefully are fodder for discussion. And later on today, we're going to hear from community voices, including my colleague Renee Wallace, who you see here in this photo, is going to be talking at the community panel later today. So we're excited for that. So I would posit that any community university partnership, like any relationship between two humans, what it means to be successful is going to be very diverse and different because every relationship is unique, right? So in a sense, a partnership is successful if the people in the partnership feel that it is, whatever that looks like in your particular type of relationship. But like any relationship between two people, a relationship between community and university partnerships that is successful is probably most often characterized by mutual trust, respect, and open communication. So obviously that has to be built between the people who are collaborating in the partnership. But I would also argue that there are institutional and larger scale factors that can either facilitate or hinder the development of such partnerships. So today I want to talk about a little bit about both of those aspects. So how, as somebody engaging in such a partnership, can you foster its success or measure its success? And then also, what are the broader institutional things we need to consider that might allow these types of partnerships to develop? So this project I'm going to talk about now in Flint, Michigan, has been mentioned, I think, at the panel yesterday, and others will probably mention it in future panels. I'm going to speak to it as one of the principal investigators from the research standpoint. So this is a project in collaboration between Michigan State University and the Community Foundation of Greater Flint, the purpose of which is to look at the Flint food system and see how it could be transformed for better outcomes in terms of sustainability, equity, access, and nutrition. It's funded through the Foundation for Food and Agriculture Research. And in Flint, the food system is particularly important because good nutrition and access to healthful foods can potentially mitigate some of the negative impacts of the water crisis and the exposure to lead that resulted from that, particularly for children. So those two things are connected together. The goal of this project, the two goals, I should say, are to identify the factors and the vicious cycles and feedbacks that maintain the Flint food system in its current suboptimal state, and to identify leverage points, whether policy or activism, et cetera, and virtuous cycles in the food system that could steer the system towards a more preferred state. And again, this is a partnership between Michigan State and community partners. So if you look at this org chart of all of the people involved in guiding this project, you can see how complex it is and how many relationships that are being managed here. So we have both university partners in the research, sitting in research seats. We have Renee Wallace, who I mentioned earlier, who is our process monitor and kind of guiding our feedback on how the community engagement is going. Miles McNall here with our Office of Outreach and Engagement at Michigan State. And then we have a number of community folks. And then we have some folks who are kind of straddling that boundary between the university and the community, like Dr. Kent Key, who is both faculty at the MSU School of Public Health and also very active in community-based research. So all of these people obviously have different, all of us, I should say, have different perspectives on what it means to have a successful partnership. And all of us, in order for the partnership to be successful, those all need to be taken into consideration. And so with gratitude to Miles McNall, who leads our fantastic evaluation team, he helped us develop a way to assess, as we're going through this project, whether people who are working on the project feel that it is successful in meeting its objectives. And there's a long list of things that we came up with as evaluation criteria, which we are assessing along the way and we'll assess at the end of the project. And there's various ways we're collecting that information, both through qualitative interviews and through some, look at the products and outcomes of the project. But here's just an example of a few things that folks raised as being important to them if we're going to assess whether this partnership was successful or not. So for example, if the project is successful, we should find that diverse Flint residents are engaged. So not just a small group of Flint residents, but across a broad spectrum of actors in the food system. If the project is successful, we should find that the results were communicated to both academic and community audiences. So not just published in scientific journals, but communicated in a way that people can use and understand. If the project is successful, we should find that all participants involved have learned new skills and useful information. And we should find that the community was involved in designing the research, not just kind of being the recipient of it. So as we're going along, we're looking at those things to kind of guide us in terms of whether we're achieving what we want to achieve. I'm going to turn now a little bit to a broader scale view, because I think it's important to talk about the context of what we're doing as well. This is a little bit talking to the university, and for those of you who are involved in university leadership, which is all of us really, if we're in leadership at the department level too. It was mentioned in the introduction that I was part of the Leshner Leadership Institute for Public Engagement in Science through the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And so here I'm sitting next to my colleague, Kirsten Schwartz, now at UCLA, who is also in that program. And together at the AAAS meeting in 2019, we gathered a bunch of academics from across different types of universities and colleges in the United States who have done community engagement. And we basically had a session where we asked them, what are the things that facilitate and the things that hinder university community partnerships in being successful? So we came up with a few things to think about from our collective experience. And I should emphasize again, this is from the university side. It's great to hear from the community side what their views are on this as well, of course, which we will next. So no surprise, one of the #1 things that was mentioned is the tenure clock, right? So if you are a tenure stream faculty at a research university, in order to be promoted and tenured, you have to demonstrate research productivity. And sometimes that is at odds with the intensive and time-consuming work that goes into building a trusting relationship with community partners, a lot of which is not considered, quote, research. Now, some solutions to that could be to assist faculty in producing creative research products that document, for example, the process of engagement as a research outcome in itself. There also, I think, is a need to reevaluate promotion and tenure processes so that we can understand, those things as valuable aspects of the process. Making connections is difficult for researchers sometimes because they may not have connections to these communities. So boundary organizations can help here. We're fortunate at Michigan State to have the Office of University Outreach and Engagement, as I mentioned before. Of course, public universities who are land grants also have extension services. And that's the historical role of these things, is to serve as a connection between the university and stakeholders and communities in the states where they operate. Funding is always a challenge. And some of our colleagues around the country who have found creative ways of fostering these partnerships have had to find ways to bridge research funding with foundation or community-based funding that's more for activism or implementation of projects. So for example, my colleague Kirsten Schwartz, as I mentioned before at UCLA, got some grants to fund what's called soil money, which goes into building partnerships even in advance of producing a proposal. And finally, we talked about trust in this group. So I think it's important to mention that in a lot of the communities in which we work, there has been a breach of trust in the past caused by either individual researchers or the actions of the university in these communities. And that isn't always acknowledged, but it can lead to a serious problem.
We seem to have temporarily lost Laura, who will hopefully come back on in a minute. We seem to have lost her sound.
So the takeaway here, to sum up, I firmly believe that strong community-university partnerships are vital for addressing real-world problems, which is increasingly important in an era of declining public funding for universities, in an era where people are increasingly struggling to see the relevance of research universities. If you talk to younger researchers, the vast majority of them, of incoming faculty, want to do work that is relevant and that is community engaged. So I would argue that if universities are good at this, they're going to attract the best pool of new young faculty. And increasingly, granting organizations, even ones that are interested in basic research, are focused on broader impacts and on community impact. So if you're able to do this well, you will attract more grant dollars, arguably. So it requires a longer term investment, probably requires some institutional change, but in the long run, it's going to be worth it. And also, strength is measured in relationships and not just products. So do people feel good about working with you at the end of the day? And do they want to work with you again? And in order to ensure that, you have to kind of think about how to build that relationship, again, based on trust, mutual respect, and communication, which is not easy, as any relationship is not easy, but I think it's absolutely very rewarding. So with that, I will close and happy to take questions. And here's my information if you'd like to contact me.
Thank you so much, Laura. So now we'll go turn things over to Nick.
I was wondering, since Laura did cut out for a second in your audio, and there was a question in the Q&A about going back over that. Should we do that now, or should we do that in the questions?
Let's do that now. Your audio cut out a little bit when you were talking about acknowledging past harms.
Oh, sure. Okay, let me go back to that slide. Yeah, I mean, that was basically the only point I was making. Hang on. Let's go back here. What was that? Hang on, my screen is frozen. Yeah, I don't have to, yeah. So the point was, among these university colleagues who had worked in community partnerships, it was striking the number of us that had heard stories from the community about egregious breaches of trust that had occurred in the community before. And you know, things like publishing people's words without their permission, things like people approaching places or people that they had been explicitly asked not to approach, etc. And we all found that when we were in the community, those things were raised. It was kind of like, well, we worked with some of you people in the past and this is what happened. And it's challenging to kind of then say, well, I'm going to try to be different. You know, of course we are. So we talked about the fact that it's important to acknowledge and recognize those breaches of trust. And if possible, to apologize for them. It's also, of course, important for researchers entering communities to be trained in appropriate, you know, ethical approaches to community engagement. So that's the point I was making.
Thank you for going back over, and thank Nick for letting us do that. So.
And sorry about the sound there. I don't know what happened, but. Yeah.
Technology. Okay. So Nick, take it away.
Thank you, Heather, for the kind introduction and for giving me the opportunity to speak with y'all. And I also want to thank Ellie for her closed captioning work. It's really important accessibility work, and I'm glad that that's a part of this webinar. I'm based at UCLA, but I'm on the East Coast right now. I'm in Mohican and Muncie Lenape territory. And let me screen share quickly. So I really, really appreciate the systematicity of Laura's approach and really set some amazing foundations that I'm very happy that I don't have to cover. So thank you, Laura, for doing all that heavy lifting for us. So basically what I wanted to talk about is situations where there are environmental issues, there are scientific issues that do not neatly fit within the place and space-based definition of a community. So how do you do community engagement when there is no community to partner with? How do you, I think maybe you're not necessarily partnering with a community as much as you are partnering and making a commitment to a problem. So that's sort of the way that I've dealt with the issue of non-place and space-based environmental issues. So what am I talking about? Let's go into this a little bit. Let's see. So this is sort of the traditional image of environmental justice. It's often communities of color in the context of environmental racism that are bearing the disproportionate burdens of the petrochemical infrastructures, other forms of mineral extraction, processing, and refinement. And I think Gwen is someone who I turn to always to think through the politics of the fence line and the relationship between these companies and the people that live nearby them. But it's not always this clearly visualizable, the issues of environmental contamination and who is the communities that are being impacted. I think over the past decades, we've come to understand it's not necessarily just bounded places like Flint that we'll hear about again maybe in a later talk as well, but also we have these infrastructural publics. Infrastructure has become this social aggregate along with gender, race, class, etc. So, sometimes I'm working with communities like in Pennsylvania in what's now the US, and communities will be traveling down the pipelines, knowing that everyone facing that pipeline beyond the exact community that they're in are facing similar environmental issues, facing similar lacks of accountability, and actually against a similar, or if not the same, company that is polluting their communities. So people will travel down this long, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but people will travel down this long pipeline that extends from Pennsylvania all the way down to the refineries in Louisiana, organizing along that infrastructure. And then also we can think about Flint as both a place-based and an infrastructure-based community, as they're bound not only by the geopolitical boundaries of the municipality, but also by the infrastructure that is providing them water. So we have these ways that infrastructural publics are already part of environmental justice. But then there's also this other aspect, which is these toxic chemicals that the US government actually doesn't regulate the toxic chemicals that move through the market, but they regulate the commodities that these toxic chemicals move through. So that's what you'll hear when you talk to EPA people that are trying to regulate a toxin or toxicant. They will always say, well, what are the commodities that we can regulate? Because the regulation moves through the market. So the two big topics in focusing on communities or commodity toxicity have been brominated flame reducers, flame retardants, and also BPE and other different endocrine disrupting can liners. And so those have been some of the more celebrated, victories. They often result in finding a chemical that's toxic and then replacing it with something that is almost identically toxic or differently toxic, maybe different toxic in a different way. So BPA that we've all probably heard of then has been replaced by BPS, which my toxicologist colleague in my department, Patrick Allard, has found to be genotoxic in a variety of ways. So this is one of the pitfalls of the ways that we are committed to problems. So if you don't have a community and you're not partnering, but you're committed to a problem, oftentimes the science-based and industry-based solution is to find substitution. And substitution is like a key way of maintaining sameness. Difference that maintains sameness. Same infrastructure, same companies, probably same feedstocks, maybe a different process and a different chemical. We found this also to be the case in flame retardants as well. So this is one of the main issues with this kind of toxic reformism. And so if we look back at that first image, that video that I showed you, zooming out of this on this video of a gentleman cutting down this tree, he's the last person in this small town called Mossville. If we come back to that image, we can see that he's also living in a mobile home. He's living in a manufactured home, it's a park unit of what's been called the FEMA trailers. The FEMA trailers are these emergency housing units that were deployed en masse 15 years ago and 2 weeks ago to the Gulf Coast after the hurricanes Katrina and Rita tore into the boundary of Mississippi and Louisiana, and then Louisiana and Texas. That was Hurricane Rita, was on the other side. And some 300,000 people came to live in these manufactured homes. They were soon found to be highly toxic. They bore elevated formaldehyde levels. Formaldehyde is this binding agent that holds together composite woods. So we basically turned, there was a mid-50s architectural fantasy that we'd all be living in plastic homes by now. And that's actually come true in a major way in terms of these polymers that we're using to make engineered woods. And so our standard of living is subsidized by the cheapness and ease of assembly of these homes based upon these modular and somewhat weather-resistant materials like engineered woods, plywoods, particle board, engineered strand board, Luan, all of these compounds that hold together our homes. So not only are they holding together our homes, but they're also causing corrosion, and they're causing unraveling. So they're holding us together and unraveling us in this structural way and then a biological way. Formaldehyde is a known irritant, an allergen, and a known human carcinogen. And so 95% of homes in California have enough formaldehyde, of new homes in California have enough formaldehyde to at least cause irritation. So in this like environmental leader of a state, we have 95% of new homes having enough formaldehyde to cause at least irritation and cancer. So that was the park unit in that last slide. And this is the travel trailer. It's the smaller one. This is sort of the most concentrated dose of formaldehyde you could get. A lot of engineered woods, very little interior space to dilute that off-gassing formaldehyde, and very poor ventilation. This is sort of what life in a FEMA trailer often looks like. This is a young woman I met in Indiana living in a resold FEMA trailer. So these trailers were resold across the country by the federal government, basically to wash their hands of them. And this is a little girl in Indiana who has a doctor's note saying that she's not allowed to be in her trailer. So this is her, because of the health issues that she was developing in being in this trailer. So this is her standing outside of it, just sort of playfully making do with an inability to be in her own shelter. So this is the distribution of when these trailers were resold across the country. This is the first iteration of the distribution. They were sold in big lots, 20,000 trailers at a time, to rural speculative entrepreneurs that would then sell them to the most dispossessed people possible. A lot of them were donated to Native nations. Mobile homes have a long history in terms of advancing settler colonialism. They were key in the colonization of North America. And now the toxic mobile homes are being donated to Native nations. They were in fracking boom towns because the rent was so high, and they're also in foreclosure crisis hotspots. And 2010 was the pinnacle of the foreclosure crisis, and also when these trailers were sold. And so we have this way that these trailers, these toxic entities, are highlighting capital crises and exacerbating health crises. And it's a problem that extends well beyond the FEMA trailers. This is a problem with how we hold together life in modernity. And I think one of the ways that I've struggled with the idea of success is that I think basically every time I think I've succeeded, I definitely haven't. And so I think this is sort of a cop-out maybe way of answering the question. If you think you've succeeded, you're probably doing it wrong. And I don't necessarily think that's true for the context of Laura's work, where there are goals articulated by the community. But when your commitment is to the problem writ large that is foundational to our standard of our mode of existence, then it's really difficult to succeed. So how can you not necessarily succeed in this like self-aggrandizement way, but how can you succeed in terms of your relationship with your conscience as you have the privilege of doing work that you feel like is affecting change? And so what I've tried to do is engage on the multiple and often conflicting temporalities of change. So we've been building low-cost remediation systems. This is using the bacteria that are found in common plant roots. The picture on the right is FEMA trailer in Mississippi, where we were first prototyping this many, many years ago. And now you can find the plans for free on publiclab.org, an organization that Gwen mentioned that she's on the board of. So remediation, that's the most short-term and possibly the smallest scale of change, because this is one home at a time, one home able to persevere in the toxic atmospheres that are made through these homes, these commodity homes. We've also been trying to do investigative journalism and talking and sort of awareness raising of the issue. This is a documentary we made of largely the people of color living in North Dakota and the fringes of the oil boom that are doing like the cash register work that are all living in FEMA trailers. It has something like 2.8 million views as of today. Sometimes it's regulation, but oftentimes these regulations really harden the problem rather than advance a solution. So formaldehyde has been regulated as a result of the FEMA trailer issue, and it is a fundamentally, I'm not gonna get into the details, it's fundamentally regressive regulation, and it is only minimizing the exposure under ideal circumstances. And the ideal circumstances are not the humidity and temperature found in Southeast, where I'm from, and they're also not the conditions of a trailer. So the exact problem that started the reform is the exact place that this reform that's been institutionalized will not address, and we're never going to change the federal regulation of formaldehyde again in the next 50 years because we spent all our political will getting a bad reform. And so there's so that's like the bureaucratic policy reforms. And then I'm also working with artists to try and imagine a different relationship with energy, because we have formaldehyde binding our world together because it's often, it's made from methane, and methane is often a free derivative when we're drilling for oil. And so you have these industry chemists saying to me, you can't argue with free. You're never going to have a world not bound together by formaldehyde because it's so free in our oil-based world. So maybe the way to get formaldehyde out of our building materials has to do with thermodynamics and like the way that we envision energy. If the way we envision energy is funneling us into oil extraction, that then allows for us to have very cheap engineered wood products. So I've been working with this artist, Tomas Sorosino. Project is too hard to explain right now, trying to envision a different thermodynamics. This is a person doing a free launch of this solar balloon. The balloon is just heated by the sun and moves with the wind that we've been mapping with colleagues at MIT. I can talk more about it, but it's trying to imagine infrastructure very differently and try to create a subjectivity of calculated submission to the environment. So this is the way that I try and measure success, is by moving at the multiple temporalities of change, from remediation, which is very small scale, but it's now, to these long-term changes that could be, returning indigenous land, that could be major overhauls in our mode of production. And then in the meantime, we're doing science, and we're also trying to change policy. So this is really how I define success in terms of my conscience. Like that's the relationship that I'm trying to discuss here. So I think I'll end there.
Thank you so much, Nick. That's going to provide so much food for thought for us for a long time to come. Yanna, I think Yanna is next. Can you? Hello. There you are. Excellent. Please.
Okay. Okay, can you hear me? Am I? Do you have my screen? No.
No. Are you able to? There it comes. Great.
Okay. Great. So thank you so much for inviting me here, Heather and It's really a great honor to be on this panel. I am speaking today as an anthropologist who works at the intersection of institutionally sanctioned scientific knowledge, community knowledge, and public health. And I'm also speaking as a parent and an activist who found herself with an infant in tow during the Washington, D.C. historic lead-in water crisis of 2001 to 2004. My comments focus on communities in crisis who turn to scientists because they have to, because they deem it necessary for bringing a crisis to an end, for surviving physically, emotionally, and socially, and for righting the wrongs that must be righted in order for solutions to last and justice to prevail. So I'd like to start with a premise, and I think it echoes a little bit what Laura said before, and I hope it's not a controversial one, that scientists' engagement with communities in crisis should be deemed successful really only when affected community members experience this engagement as helpful. In other words, calling scientific engagement successful when affected community members experience it as unhelpful or even harmful should be recognized as an exercise in power that can blur the boundary between helping and hurting and can create serious risks for both communities and for science. A logical corollary to this premise is that knowing what type of engagement, if any, a community considers helpful is imperative for the engagement to be successful. The concern I'd like to raise today is that even though there are many individual scientists and many presenting at this conference who prioritize community needs and tailor their work to meet those needs, I think that the current system in place that promotes and facilitates scientists' engagement with communities in crisis is really not across the board focused on the alignment between what communities want and what scientists offer. And I think it's also certainly not across the board focused on the harm that can result when these two things diverge. This is a dangerous place to be in, I think, because it leaves the scientific community vulnerable to building an enterprise of engagement science, if you will, that ends up reflecting scientists' imaginaries of helpfulness more than frontline communities' experiences of it. If we're interested in ensuring that scientists' engagement with communities in crisis is experienced by communities as helpful, I think we ought to pay close attention to the system that promotes and facilitates community-engaged science and to work hard to help reform it. Misalignments between scientists and communities in crisis have been raised as a problem by many communities. And there are outstanding speakers at this conference, like Kyle White and Ben Pauly and my fellow panelist, Gwen Ottinger, who've written insightfully about them. What I'd like to highlight here is that frontline communities have a deeply informed sense for what types of help they need from scientists and for what harms can result when they're not heard. Scientists' failure to listen to communities and improve community engagement accordingly is, I think, a moral failure that necessitates serious examination. Last summer, I had the privilege to organize, together with my colleague Nathan Canny, a community member panel at the annual meeting of the American Society for Engineering Education. 5 frontline community members from Buffalo, New York, Flint, Michigan, Isle de Jean Charles, Louisiana, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and Tampa, Florida, presented their experiences with scientists and engineers and shared insights into types of community engagement they deem desirable and just. Points the panelists made that I think are especially pertinent to us today are, first, that although crises often have technical dimensions, they tend to be deeply social too. They usually embed historical injustices and entrenched power imbalances between those contributing to the crisis and those most affected by it. This means that solutions tend to require multiple types of expertise beyond the scientific and multiple types of actions beyond research. The second point is that although scientific expertise can be extremely important and at times even catalytic in affecting change, community expertise is as important because it comes from a place of deep familiarity with the people and the issues at stake, and it brings unique insights to the search for solutions. Combining historical knowledge with lived experience, with community-led observations, and with community-designed research, community expertise can expand or even correct scientific understandings of a crisis. Moreover, it can support the development of solutions that are effective by ensuring that they take into account a community's knowledge, values, and visions for a better future. And the third point is that scientists often have difficulty appreciating the imperative of learning from communities so that they can advance their own understanding of a crisis and refine the help that they bring. The result of this can be harm, and harm in various forms, including marginalization of people who are already marginalized, flawed interpretations of the crisis, one-size-fits-all solutions that actually don't fit, appropriation or exploitation of community work, and an imposition of scientist-centered narratives that are divorced from people's realities on the ground. In the end, these harms can undermine community work and bolster the very social orders that made the crisis possible in the first place. Ironically, all this can occur under the celebratory banner of doing science for the public good. One of the speakers at ASE last year, Yvonne Lewis, a Flint resident and the founder and CEO of the National Center for African American Health Consciousness, asked, and I quote, "When issues of concern arise during the process of engagement, we wonder where would the place be for us to come to talk about the challenges that we faced," unquote. Indeed, STEM's community engagement enterprise, which funds scientists to go out and help communities in crisis, which gives scientists the authority to write about communities and speak on communities' behalf, which celebrates scientists for their work with communities, and which makes determinations about what types of engagement are exemplary. It does not have an office where communities can file grievances about scientists' work in their midst. Ago, for example, 60 Flint residents signed a historic letter protesting the engineering intervention that had come to help them. The letter asked numerous entities in STEM that had celebrated this intervention to conduct an investigation that placed the protesters' voice at the center. Flint residents who signed the letter say that to this day, no entity in STEM has reached out to speak with them directly, let alone conduct the investigation that they requested. Communities have tried to take matters into their own hands by developing their own research policies and asserting their own methodologies. Tribal nations are at the forefront of this movement, and there are others following suit. Rebecca Newberry, Executive Director of Clean Air Coalition of Western New York, who's going to be speaking on the next panel today, offers a link to her own organization's academic research policy, and that's on the PEWS website. Elvejo in Chicago has developed an academic partnership guidelines, which state explicitly that absent community control of research initiatives, the production of knowledge can be harmful and can replicate, quote, the cultures of colonial mentality, exploitation, and extraction that Elvejo fully resists, unquote. My guess is that most communities lack such policies, but even if they didn't, leaving it to marginalized communities in crisis to figure out how to benefit from scientist engagement while avoiding serious harm is I think, a very serious, if not morally indefensible oversight. I think it's time for us to heed community calls for a paradigm shift. Numerous academics have made the same argument as well. In doing so, it behooves us to focus on the system that promotes and facilitates what appears to be uncritical, in some cases, community engagement. Funders, academic journals, professional societies, and of course the colleges and universities under whose auspices much of this work is executed. I'm referring to an extensive network of institutions, including, of course, EPA and NSF, the Citizen Science Association and its journal, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and institutions of higher learning that seem to like to help communities, but not to have to deal with them when things go wrong. I have seen firsthand how this system, which seems to genuinely aspire to serve the public good, is vulnerable to subverting its own goals. It's a system that I fear normalizes the funding of community engaged work, the publication of writings about such work, and the celebration of community engaged scientists based almost exclusively on scientists' own stories about the engagement. At the same time, it's a system that has shown a disturbing degree of disregard for communities that push back against scientists' work and narratives. Even worse, it's a system that tolerates scientists' intimidation, bullying, and stigmatization of communities that fail to comply. I personally witnessed with dismay the birth 4 years ago and the evolution all the way to this day of the claim that Flint residents likely caused a serious bacterial outbreak and made themselves sick due to their supposed poor hygiene. Echoing colonial ideologies, the insinuation struck me as questionable from the get-go. I tried to look into it and was soon informed by the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services that this was a claim that was not supported by epidemiological evidence. Still, it managed, it seems, to masquerade as science and somehow make its way into the Citizen Science Association journal, which gave it an air of credibility. Months ago, the claim was formally debunked in the American Journal of Public Health. This is a case where I fear the Citizen Science Association, an entity championing the benefits of citizen science, turned itself into a vehicle for the perpetuation of disabling stereotypes and the reification of a social order wherein power, authority, and purity, both physical and intellectual, reside with scientists. Needless to say, the potential erosion of community trust is significant here, and Laura touched on this too before in her talk. STEM's community engagement, I think, can bring meaningful change by working with communities to understand, confront, and repair harms of its own creation. By developing training and supporting, both training and support programs for scientists, and by institutionalizing rights and protections for communities. Also by adopting oversight mechanisms that guide projects from start to finish, as well as accountability structures that hold scientists responsible for misconduct and harm. Moreover, scientists, I believe, must begin to speak out, must stand by communities crying out for help, even if they're not personally and directly involved in these communities. Must show intolerance for community engagement that erects itself, and the enterprise as well, a system that elevates and erects itself on the backs of communities in crisis, and must, of course, engage in difficult conversations. I'll close with the second part of the quote by Yvonne Lewis in Flint, who asserted last summer at ASCE that unless we're willing to engage in conversation through the difficulties, we will never get to solutions that will be beneficial to all. And so I think that engaging in conversation and really understanding harms and understanding together how repair can happen and how successful collaborations can occur is really critical for the successful development of this work of community engagement. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Yanna. That was really both depressing and inspiring. That was, thank you. And now for our final speaker, Gwen Ottinger.
And as the final speaker, I have the challenge of saying something that hasn't been said. These wonderful presentations we have already heard, I think, cover much of the grounds that I will, and perhaps the way I will cover it will bring something new to the conversation. So I began studying communities, as Nick said, fence line communities that were engaged in science. In 2001, I began studying them, and they had been working on air monitoring programs for the past 5 or 6 years. And I want to be clear that these were their own air monitoring programs. They were, the communities were working with scientists and organizers from nonprofit organizations, but there weren't universities involved to any great extent. And it is from my experience watching their engagement with a tool called buckets and their development of fence line air monitors that I have come to my understanding of what constitutes success. Now, I don't seem to be able to advance my slides. Does anyone know how I can do that? Let me try a different approach.
Yeah, arrows should be able to
There
do
we go. All right, it seems if I try this, it'll work. Okay, so let me start with my definition of success. And the first one is that, so I'm not taking for granted that there are university scientists in the process. And I think successful community-driven science recognizes the people who are involved in it as people who have something to contribute to knowledge, right? So there are a lot of situations where I have seen encounters between scientists and communities under the citizen science rubric that assumes that communities are, you know, they have they can be good as data collectors, or their diversity is important, you know, bringing diverse people into the picture is important, but doesn't fully honor that they have some knowledge to bring. And I think that's, this is what we're hinting at when we say communities need to be involved in the design of a research program and that sort of thing. This is the criterion that I would call them. The second thing that I think is really important is that community programs that are the most successful are ones that are able to point to harms that aren't well represented in the regulatory system or in scientific frameworks for understanding the world, and give them a name and give them a measurement. So the buckets that I've studied for so long actually look at subacute, infrequent releases of toxic chemicals. Okay, so it doesn't really fit the public health definition of chronic, and it doesn't fit the level of acute. And so there's something in between. One organizer I know calls it getting gassed, which is an unfortunate term, but designed to be inflammatory. But it raises a category of problem that's not acknowledged in the regulatory system, or for that matter, really in scientific ways of knowing. I have also been involved with a project with activists to try and quantify the toxic soup that people living next to petrochemical plants talk about. How do you quantify toxic soup, right? So metrics for acknowledged problems, or metrics for problems that communities have identified where they're lacking, these are ways that a community-led science program can be successul. And then finally, across the board, the folks that I've worked with have, you know, it's not worth it if it doesn't somehow generate pressure for changing the system. And you've heard that from all of the panelists so far in different kinds of ways, but this is really where the rubber meets the road. All right, so how do we get there? What are the factors that enable success? So collaboration with scientists can ensure that people's results are taken more seriously. And they can it can expand the potential for new methods and new concepts, right? So our experiments around developing a toxic soup index took some programmers and some data scientists because there was just so much data to look through. And that wasn't work that the community wanted to do or should have had to do. So there's the kinds of knowledge and skills that scientists and university-based researchers bring can really bring something to the collaboration that wouldn't have been there otherwise. All right. But like I said, I wouldn't take for granted that collaboration with scientists is a factor enabling success. And this is what Yanna just told you. And so what are the requirements of scientists? We don't often problematize their participation or their readiness to participate with communities, but I have some overarching ideas about how they should show up, how we should show up in those spaces. The first that I would say would be to show qualities that we can describe as epistemic virtues. So these are first humility. You don't know everything and other people know things too. And that gets back to respect for people as knowers. Open-mindedness. When somebody tells you that the sort of mid-sized release that happens every 2 months is slowly degrading their health, or they never had asthma until that one day, that one big fire, you don't say, oh no, that's not how it happens. That's that's not in our models. You say, oh, well, maybe that could be. Shall we check it out? So the curiosity to say, okay, can we take that as a hypothesis? I have to give credit where credit is due. After quite a bit of organizing with bucket air monitors, there was a community in southeastern Louisiana who had the African American community had one relocation away from the Shell petrochemical plant that was there, and the plant had agreed to do a study of the air quality across this town. Now this town was, 4,500 people and all of 2 square miles, but the community had been was segregated and had been so divided over this idea of whether the plant caused air quality problems that people started to ask the question, well, maybe our air is not like their air. And the scientists at Shell kept saying, well, this is a tiny place and it's well-mixed air. We know it's well-mixed air. But they heard this enough from the community that they said, okay, all right, we think it's well-mixed air, but let's do the experiment. Okay, so this was a moment of both open-mindedness and curiosity. The rest of the story, they weren't so stellar, but that moment I think importantly captures this idea of exhibiting epistemic virtues in a collaboration. You also need scientists who demonstrate political savvy. That's kind of my best way of putting it. And so I see studies getting done with the help of university scientists, where the goal is to do the best science possible on the theory that having the good science will lead to change, because it's good science and it will inform change. Those of us who study science in policy know that this is not how it works. Empirically, that's just not accurate. Policy change occurs through organizing and a whole bunch of the science that you feed into the process has to be kind of carefully tailored to the context for it to work and be accepted and all that kind of thing. So you can't just assume that because you've got the facts right, that can't be the goal. So another way to say this is, Heather's work has named the value neutral ideal that guides policy and says that it's sort of it's a relatively new thing, but it's one that a lot of scientists seem to subscribe to or think they need to subscribe to, where a better model would be to think about strategic boundary work. Like, yeah, you have to somehow get from the activist space to the regulatory space, and that takes some massaging. But that is, when you know that that's what you're doing, you can do it cleverly and in league with activists, as opposed to pretending like that's not how it works. And finally, I would say scientists are successful in collaboration with communities when they seek the deep contextual knowledge of what's going on. Like Yanna says, you know, environmental crises are social and political crises as well, right? And you need to know what all else is going on. Now, this does not mean that every scientist needs to be an ethnographer. Some I have seen are very good listeners and very smart about asking a lot of questions before they charge in. That's one way to do it. The kind of boundary organizations that Laura was talking about, though, can also serve this function of helping to translate and give the scientists who are participating the kinds of context that they need to participate effectively. Social science collaborators are also, you know, having a social scientist on your team along with the scientists is also another way to accomplish this, right? So I think I will, that's very short, but I'm the last one. So I think that you're probably ready to be done listening to this anyway. So if there's, I would say that, you know, these are really this is how I would think about enabling the success of community collaboration with scientists, having to do with how can scientists show up in ways that help increase the recognition of community members as knowers, that help create new ways of understanding environmental problems, and that focus on, that create pressure for actual change. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Gwen. These have been really wonderful talks. I want to give the panel a bit of, you know, a couple minutes to talk to each other. Do you have anything that you want to raise with each other about your talks at this time?
I guess I just want to thank Yanna for making some really important points, all of which I agree with. And I really like the idea of having a formal grievance process that community members can access, or even just a way of raising concerns or questions or asking for conflict resolution. And I think that would enhance some of the accountability and transparency that I just mentioned briefly in my remarks as well. So I really like that idea. And of course, other, you know, community folks have raised that over the years as well. Yeah.
Does anyone have anything else? So I was wondering what you all thought of the there's sort of a tension between issues of responsibility and accountability, and whether or not we're talking about ethics or we're talking about regulations for community engagement, and sort of where we probably need both, but where should the emphasis lie in between those things, and how and where the institutional locations are for thinking about codes of ethics, which are sort of responsibility based, versus accountability mechanisms that are sort of more institutional based. Does anyone have any ideas about that? Or am I just making your life complicated?
Would you repeat the question, Heather?
Yeah, so I was wondering, in thinking about responsibilities to communities and accountability to communities, where should the emphasis be for different kinds of structures? So codes of ethics are very often about responsibilities, as opposed to things like grievance procedures, which are about accountability, and sort of holding scientists to account for not meeting certain standards. And in this sort of space of thinking about community engaged research, should we be sort of emphasizing one over the other at this point in time? Should we be pursuing both? Where do you think these structures should lie?
I've been thinking about this a lot, and it seems to me that both are incredibly useful and really feeding into each other and supporting each other. It does seem to me that the idea that we have a system right now that allows for the engagement of scientists and academics more broadly with communities, and especially communities in crisis. I personally have been just focusing on vulnerable and marginalized communities in crisis. But the idea that, many folks who do go into these spaces do not have any training and have had no ethics background, I think is a problem, and I think that it's fixable and something that can really support scientists in doing this work. At the same time, I do believe that ethical principles and training programs could work really well together with oversight and accountability mechanisms. And in fact, in medicine, for example, you have physicians, who get all sorts of training. And then there are oversight and accountability mechanisms. When it comes to community engagement, unfortunately, we have none of these things.
Nick, you want to jump in on this?
Yeah, I think that there was a line in when Yanna was speaking earlier about trying to create structures for repair. And I think that is fundamental to everything that we're doing here. Like, we have this moment where we have under accountability of scientists. We also have under accountability of the pollution producing industries that they are studying. And then we have the over policing of communities of color happening in these same polluted communities. So I think that there's a broader need for accountability as like one of the foundational kinds of interventions that can be made, and I think something that modeling these modes of accountability in our own work is also modeling modes of accountability that can scale, that can be seen as successes and interventions in the problem itself. So I think in this moment of mass incarceration and really questioning regimes of policing, I think it's a moment to be thinking exactly as Yanna has outlined about how we can create accountability protocols, how we can create robust relationships and heal when there's mistrust that is inevitably going to happen at times. Communication is always hard. And so I think going beyond ethics as a philosophical institution, I think about like the ethics committees that meet at hospitals that sort of like punt around Kant or something like that, is not really where I see justice happening. Sorry, I read about Kant sometimes.
I don't think that's actually a fair description of what happens in ethics communities and hospitals, but that's fine.
The only one I read in on, I was like, what is happening here? So yeah, I apologize, hospital ethicists. That was a low blow. But I think that there are moments. Yeah. Anyway, there are systems of accountability that have been existent prior to colonization. There are also systems of community accountability that are being robustly documented over the last 15, 20 years. And so I think we can turn to these protocols for community accountability that are emerging out of communities that can't call the police and don't want to call the police because they called harm. And I think that's where we should look for how to create accountability within science as well.
All right.
If I might add to that, I mean, it seems to me that Heather, you sort of said which of these should we put our energy into? It seems to me that you can have sort of responsibility and codes of ethics without accountability outside the community who has adopted the code of ethics, right? That accountability need not draw in other kinds of stakeholders. Whereas to have accountability, you have to have the responsibility, right? And as you build your mechanisms for accountability, I would think that if you built them with, if you built them well, you would have to build them in conversation with both the more and the less powerful. And that would take you a different place in terms of how you define professional responsibilities. So that, I mean, that's, you know, given a choice of where to put our energy, well, accountability, I think, will get us where we want to go more directly because it requires these other steps. I would also say that there's a real issue about what keeps the powerful actors at the table when we start talking about accountability. Because you can set up all the processes you want, but if those people are ultimately powerful enough to walk, and the less powerful people at the table not powerful enough to keep them from walking, you've got nothing. And that's something I think a lot about in terms of sort of corporate social responsibility, because, you know, they'll say, yeah, sure, great. We do all these responsible things. Yes, we'll listen to you. But the minute they start hearing something they really don't like, they're out. And there's nothing to stop them. So figuring out how to create a mechanism that actually ties the more powerful people to have to commit to solutions. I think that's the problem that needs to be solved. I don't know what it is, what the solution is.
That's big. And at that moment, I think we should turn to questions from our audience. So Megan, I think you've been watching the Q&A build. So
yes, I have. We have some great questions here, and the upvoting is working really nicely as well. So the first question I'm going to ask is from Kevin Elliott, who says, these presentations have been amazing. Thank you. Building on Yanna's presentation, I'd be curious to hear thoughts from her or any other panelists on how scientists can operate responsibly when there seem to be very different perspectives among community members about how best to handle a problem. Suppose they want to respect the goals of the community and not overstep, and they're afraid that if they try to work with one group of community members to help to do what they're calling for, it might clash with what other community members want to see happening. How would you recommend operating in these sorts of situations?
I mean, I think, you know, that's a really good question. And I think that it raises really the question of diversity within communities. And obviously the communities are not monolithic. And I think it's a great question to raise again for the next panel, because there's community members there who'll be speaking. But I do think that, you know, in working as a scientist, if there are conflicts between the you know, different groups in a community, I do think that it's important to understand what those are. And then a scientist who decides that they will enter that space, then to make sure that they are transparent about what they're doing, why they're doing it, and what the consequences might be. But I do think that it behooves us all, scientists or not, working in communities, to know what the dynamics are when we're stepping in there and working with one group over another. But hopefully in the process of working with a group and being in communication with others, hopefully, you know, groups can be brought together.
I wondered if anyone else wanted to weigh in, or if I should.
I mean, that's a lot to lay on a scientist to bring groups together. And I wonder if the question doesn't suppose, hi Kevin, by the way, I wonder if the question doesn't suppose that the scientist is sort of going in as opposed to being a consultant, right? Sort of serving at the will of the community, being solicited by the community. We need you, would you come? In which case, I think the consultant's role is clear on, you know, if in a consultant role, you could imagine serving a subset of the community, and then it doesn't completely take away the problems, but it casts a slightly different light on the kind of on the question and the ethical position of that person.
I think that's, so obviously there's no easy answer here. I just wanted to add that it's common that the scientists don't agree on the best way to approach the problem or the, you know, the situation either, and there's conflict in the scientific team. In fact, I would say in the Flint project so far, we've had more butting heads among the university partners than, you know, among the community partners. And we worked it out, but just to add to the point, like, scientists are humans, they're part of the system too, and they also have conflict, so.
Right, so I'm gonna move to the next question, which I think is related a bit. So Eric Kennedy says, really great talks, everyone. I'm curious to dig into Yanna's premise a little, that success is when the intervention is seen as helpful by the community themselves. Although the question is broader, applicable to all panelists. I think we've had a very warm, fuzzy vision of communities throughout this session, which is largely taken community as synonymous with unjustly marginalized groups. While Yanna's premise seems to be true for engagement with some communities, it doesn't seem like a generalizable principle. One could imagine a highly racist or homophobic community, for instance, and likely wouldn't want to applaud scientific engagement as seen as helpful by this community. It seems then that maybe this principle turns into something other than foregrounding communities, perhaps only with respect to marginalized communities, when challenging existing power, when aligned with principles of justice or equity. Are these lessons applicable to all communities? If not, how do we know where and when?
This is particularly exciting given Nick's non-spatial sense of community.
I mean, you know, I can just share, you know, some initial thoughts. I mean, I really do believe that, you know, engagement with communities is a political act, because it involves shifts in power in communities that, you know, are oftentimes deprived of technical expertise. Then they have it, and there's there can be a lot of shifts as these collaborations happen. And I think also, you know, whom a scientist works with is also a political decision. And so, you know, again, I was very specifically speaking about marginalized communities finding themselves in crisis and needing urgent help to try and bring an end to the crisis. But I do believe that, of course, there's all sorts of groups out there, and scientists' decisions to work with one group or another are political decisions. And again, transparency is so important, so that scientists themselves know and communities know what they're doing and why they're doing it and why they've aligned with different groups.
May I just add, this is going to be unpopular, but it's not clear to me that the hypothetical villainous group is in necessarily any less deserving of curiosity and open-mindedness. Right, that that perhaps there's something there. I can't help but look at the world as it is now and say, clearly people are feeling not heard and are being talked down to, and what's going on there? Like, what's the actual question here? What's the thing we need to know more about? What are the harms that are being done? So I mean, I don't know. I really, yeah, I think we may owe more people curiosity than we're giving them at the moment.
Okay. So the next seems like it's not really a question, but Jen Schneider says, really appreciate Nick's framing of being in a relationship with a problem and not just a relationship with a community. I know it's not necessarily binary, but helpful, opens up different possibilities and practices. And then Mahmoud Farouk asks, in the university-community relationship, given the power imbalance and ethical and moral issues raised, who should bear the burden of cultural institutional change? Reform of the tenure process is still asking for outcome measures universities care for, which are mostly science and not community-centric. Should there be community-based boundary organizations playing an honest brokering role to manage this relationship?
Yes, if the university will pay them.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned the tenure process, so maybe, I don't know if the question is for me, but so totally agree with what Gwen just said, first of all. Don't ask for unpaid labor from people who are already marginalized. But secondly, yeah, I think it would be awesome if there were voices from the community or from partners involved in the tenure process, and I think we should think seriously about that. I also think that within the university itself, there are various levels of power and marginalization. And one thing we tend to see, like, believe me, if you go to any community engaged research symposium, the faculty you see there are not as overwhelmingly white and male and senior as the faculty that are more, quote, productive and traditional research means, which means like publishing in Science and Nature. So if we want people to, if we believe that these partnerships can be valuable, and we want to support the faculty who are engaging in them, I think that that kind of institutional reform is necessary, and particularly to protect early career faculty, female faculty, faculty of color. And we want more people from diverse communities, I would say, in our university institutions. And often those folks want to engage in partnerships with the communities they come from. So I think that's worth considering too.
I just had a question for everyone else based upon that question. I didn't know if y'all are aware of people that have served as a broker, or are there people that are trying to position themselves as science brokers, and you know, what our role is in promoting them. I mean, I would just love to know. Like, this is sort of the joy of being on a panel with y'all, is if you have worked with people. I think about some of the community members in Tonawanda who have been navigating between universities and community issues, but for their own issue. I didn't know if there were people that have taken the mantle of being a facilitator as a result of having realized the lack of accountability there. Do y'all know of anyone that does that?
I think of some of Shakobi Wilson's work, that the West, is it West? I forget the name. There's I'm mixing up, but they have published a sort of community engagement model for participatory research that is very community led. So it's not quite a brokering role, but it's a sort of a model that they've offered to others.
So in the Flint project, I would say we're working closely with two brokering groups, one within the university and one within the community. So the Community Foundation of Greater Flint is kind of a brokering role with you know, the community at a smaller scale. And then within our university, we have the Office of Outreach and Engagement, which serves a really critical role in that regard, as does our extension system, as I mentioned earlier. so, I mean, obviously I think that within the university, those types of organizations should be supported financially and with excellent staff hires. And, you know, when we're in an era of budget cuts as we are now, unfortunately, I think the short-term thinking tends not to value those roles. But universally, faculty that engage in this kind of work, I think, find it extremely valuable to have those people at the university.
Okay. I'm going to ask, I have a question from Kishori Hari. I hope I'm saying that correctly. What's the thinking around community partnerships around potential future issues before they arise? For example, automation, self-driving cars, even a COVID vaccine. Typically, these are less common, but a harm frame could be seen as even more important.
So, you know, there is such a thing as participatory technology assessment, which is an attempt to try to get communities together in some way to assess these sorts of things before they're pushed out. And we're going to hear more about that in sort of representative sampling work next week, which is very often how participatory technology assessment is constructed. But that's, I think one of my graduate students who just went to UCSD actually is interested in thinking about community-based participatory technology assessment. So getting communities, for example, to assess how they view autonomous vehicles before they're deployed widely.
Yeah, Heather, that's a great example. I would also say community-based scenario development can be a way of future scoping that I've worked with a bit in the past. So looking at future risks and so I've done this, for example, around climate change adaptation in West Africa.
Nice, super interesting.
Do we have time for one more?
We have time for one more.
Okay, there's a comment in there that I'm gonna bypass and go to the last question, which is from Nitya, who says, I work with scientists at my institute to gain skills and effective community engagement through community outreach. I myself am a scientist turned informal science educator, and I'm learning about communities of practice and community engagement. One question I constantly find myself asking is, how do we get faculty, older scientists, to see the value in community engagement? And how do we help institutes to see these different communities of practice, not just the one they have been using for broader impacts in the last decade?
You know, I've been wondering this myself, and it seems to me that people don't pay attention until they see the need, till they see what they have at stake, what the problem is that they have, that, you know, this is the answer to, if you see what I mean. And so, you know, one way would be to actually proactively make participatory research part of the expectation of a faculty position, right? Then everybody would pay attention real fast. I'm not necessarily recommending that. I don't know if that's, you know, the right way to go, but I think, again, if there's nothing to keep them at the table, then why would they?
You know, I also think that you know, the faculty who do appreciate the importance of participatory research and community engagement are probably the best folks to be doing this work and bringing it back to the university and showing by example what it can do. And, you know, and at the end of the day, I do have to say that I personally believe that, you know, not everybody's made for this work. And so that if one really has to convince faculty members that this is important work, perhaps this isn't it for them. And perhaps you know, they wouldn't be able to offer as much to communities. And so I think appreciating that, you know, this might be the kind of work that is a calling for some people and not so much for others, that might be okay too, and really good from a community perspective, to know that whoever's there is there because they really want to be there.
That sounds right. And that sounds echoes a lot of what Tina Phillips was saying here talk yesterday about not every project can do everything. Thank you so much for your insights and your wisdom and your efforts today. I will hope everyone can rejoin us at 3 o'clock for the next panel, Community Perspectives on this sort of work. Thank you so much. Bye.